Hello, thank you for watching this video. So my name is Katsunori Miyahara, and I'm a lecturer in philosophy at the Center for Human Nature, Artificial Intelligence and Neuroscience in Hokkaido University, Japan. And today's talk is based on a paper in progress, which I'm working with my co-author, Dr. Seisuke Hayakawa at the University of Tokyo. The goal of this talk is to examine the role of mental simulation in empathy by looking into a form of empathy situated in embodied interaction. And we'll try to argue that mental simulation can play a key role in empathy, but that this concept doesn't offer a full explanation of this phenomenon. And we want to say that empathic interaction is possible only when anchored in an embodied epistemic attitude of receptivity. Just to give a little bit of clarification, some people use empathy as an umbrella concept to describe a group of mental types, including sympathy, compassion, sorrow, and so on. And other people use the term to describe a more specific mental type, yet they do so in various ways. Now, in this talk, when we say empathy, we mean empathic perspective taking, that is, the experience of sharing in another's perspective on the world. Simulation accounts of empathy, or empathic perspective taking, identify this as the act of reproducing a mental state that resembles another's mental state in imagination. So on these accounts, to empathize with another is to imagine what it would be like to be the other person, or for the other person to experience the situation that she's in. So this is the phenomenon of our interest in this talk. This is the outline of the talk. So I just finished the introduction, and in the next section, we're going to introduce a case of empathy or type of empathy we call empathy through listening. And in the following section, we'll glean two features of this type of empathy, empathy through listening, which seem to complicate simulation accounts of empathy. And then in the final section, we want to advance the notion of receptivity to complement existing theories of empathy and clarify what exactly it means to talk about receptivity. So empathy through listening. Now let us begin by an example of a successful case of empathic perspective taking. So we call this example Pat and Nate. Pat has been admitted to the hospital due to a heart attack, but fortunately, her recent examination yielded excellent results. Her assigned nurse, Nate, tells her that she can begin rehabilitation soon. Unexpectedly, however, Pat shows no interest. This worries Nate, and he asks if anything is wrong. Prompted by Nate's question, Pat talks about her constant fear of having another heart attack and her anxiety over the prospect of leaving the hospital soon. Nate realizes with embarrassment that he had overlooked all this and tells her that it must have been hard. However, he also asks her if she would nevertheless consider joining the rehabilitation program. Although her resentment is not completely cleared, Pat feels some satisfaction and tells him that she'll think about it. Now, in this case, Nate, the nurse, seemingly manages to improve his relationship with Pat, the patient, by sharing in her perspective on the situation, that is, by means of what we call empathic perspective taking. So simulationists would claim that here Nate accomplishes this by developing a mental simulation of Pat's mind. So on their account, Nate would be imagining what it would be like for Pat to be in her situation. But here, Nate's empathy is not achieved by mental simulation alone, but obviously it is also enabled by his listening attentively to her. And we want to call this kind of empathy, this form of empathy, empathy through listening. Now, how does this affect simulationism? Simulationists rarely highlight the role of listening in empathy, but this doesn't necessarily mean that they cannot accommodate this act of listening in their framework. Listening is clearly a convenient way to attain information about another that will prove useful in imagining another's perspective on the world accurately. So, in this sense, simulationism can easily accommodate the role of listening in their account of empathy. But we want to say that there's more we can learn about mental simulation and empathy from this case. So specifically, we argue that Pat and Nate illuminates two features of empathy which are hardly acknowledged in the literature. The first feature is how empathic perspective taking can be an embodied collaborative practice rather than an imaginative enterprise that happens in an individual mind. And the second claim is that empathic perspective taking can occur at two different levels of imaginative perspective taking and realistic perspective sharing. So let me explain what we mean by this. Simulationists typically consider mental simulation as an individualistic enterprise sustained exclusively by internal psychological processes of imagining the other person's mental state. However, in the present case, Nate shares in Pat's perspective by engaging her in a conversation. So the process of generating a mental simulation is sustained by an interactive process that runs between the empathizing and the empathized agent, between Nate and Pat. So this suggests that sharing in another's perspective is not always a mental action confined in an individual mind, but can also be an embodied collaborative practice involving multiple agents. Now, this relates to another point. Simulationists tend to depict the other to be empathized as a passive target, and they often use this word target in describing empathy. And on this notion, the other to be empathized plays no active role in the process of generating the shared perspective. They're just a target. But in the present case, empathic perspective taking is made possible thanks in part to Pat's active engagement in the conversation. So even if Nate was fully prepared to listen to her, he couldn't have empathized successfully with Pat if Pat declined to share her story, if Pat declined to engage in the conversation with Nate. So Nate could share in Pat's perspective partly because of her willingness to exercise her epistemic agency, that is, her willingness to make a sincere attempt to articulate her perspective on the situation to him. The second observation we want to make is that this case suggests that empathic perspective taking occurs at two levels. So the first level is what we call the level of imaginative perspective taking, which consists of imagining the other's perspective by means of mental simulation. So Nate achieves this level of empathy when he imagines, for example, how fearful it must have been for Pat to be told by the doctor that she can have another heart attack. Now, this is what standard simulation accounts identify as empathy. But we think that there's another level of empathic perspective taking, which we call realistic perspective sharing, that involves actually coming to see the situation in the same way as the other. So this one goes beyond mere imagination. Nate reaches this level of empathy when he revises his own take on the situation in light of his interaction with Pat. So for example, Nate might realize that the way in which the doctor informed her about the possibility of a recurrent heart attack was uncaring and problematic. So in this case, he shares in Pat's perspective on the world in the stronger sense than the first case of imaginative perspective taking, in the stronger sense of actually understanding the situation in the same terms as her. Now, this deeper level of empathy requires the empathizing agent to undergo an epistemic self-transformation. So by which we mean that this is possible only when one comes to see the situation differently from the way he or she saw the situation herself prior to the interaction. Now, this contrasts with how imaginative perspective taking can be achieved through mental simulation conducted from a safe distance, so to say, without exposing one's own realistic epistemic stance on the world to any risk. So one can imagine, Nate might have imagined what it would feel, what it must have felt for Pat to be in her situation without changing his own take on the situation at all. So now to section 4, anchoring empathy in receptivity. So we've seen that empathic perspective taking can be realized through embodied interaction and can reach the level of realistic perspective sharing. And this suggests that our capacity for empathy is not fully explained in terms of mental simulation. A natural question to ask here is, what additional capacity is then involved in empathy through listening? What do we need to interact with others empathically in such a way that we can empathize with them deeply at the level of realistic perspective sharing? In this respect, we want to turn to theories of empathy in the context of care ethics. Care ethicists such as Noddings, Sloat, and Hayakawa, one of us, claim that the virtue of receptivity is the key foundation of empathy. In these views, empathic perspective taking depends not so much on the use of imagination, as is claimed in simulation theories, but rather on the adoption of what they call a receptive attitude towards another. So Nell Nodding says that empathy is a matter of reception. She says, I do not put myself in the other's shoes, so to speak, by analyzing his reality as objective data and then asking, how would I feel in such a situation? On the contrary, I set aside my temptation to analyze and to plan. I do not project. I receive the other into myself, and I see and feel with the other. But what does it exactly mean to be receptive, to adopt a receptive attitude toward another? And we want to suggest that it is a matter of adopting an embodied epistemic attitude involving epistemic respect and embodied attunement. So on our count, the first hallmark of receptivity is that you treat another as an epistemic agent who can provide you with an opportunity to gain new knowledge about the world. Michael Sloat holds that receptivity is closely related to open-mindedness. The only difference being between open-mindedness and receptivity being that being receptive to the idea or suggestion of change implies more readiness to change than mere talk of openness does. So both open-mindedness and receptivity is primarily a matter of being open to another person's ideas and opinions. So in this regard, Nate was indeed receptive to Pat by being ready to acknowledge his oversight and change his view on the quality of doctor-patient relationship in his hospital, in his hospital in light of Pat's story. Now, a similar claim has been made by Eliza Magri, who says that empathy involves respect towards the epistemic dignity of another's subjective experience. That is, recognition that another situated experience is worthy of attention and discernment for its own sake. So if Nate did not have a respect for Pat's epistemic dignity, he could have dismissed her fear and anxiety as unreasonable subjective responses to the situation as he sees it. So he's been seeing it as, so he's been thinking that Pat has positive, excellent test results. So he's been thinking that Pat should be happy about it and must be looking forward to starting rehabilitation. And in that light, he could have taken Pat's report about her worry and anxiety as being unreasonable. That is, if he didn't have the respect. So in that case, empathic perspective taking would have been impossible, both at the level of imaginative perspective taking and realistic perspective sharing. So that was the first aspect of receptivity as we see it. But that's not the whole story. The second hallmark of receptivity on our account is that you have your embodied dynamics aligned with the other in interaction. So for example, if you want to learn about another's perspective by listening to her, you must allow her plenty of time to elaborate her story. This is partly because, especially in cases of complicated predicaments, it's difficult to describe your own experience. So it takes time to do that. So unless you wait for the other to put their experience into words, you won't be able to really share the experience with them. So we can safely assume that in the present case, Nate did exactly this for Pat. By contrast, if Nate had to leave, or if he asked questions impatiently, or if he just glanced at his watch before Pat finished her story, he could have failed to share in her perspective. So this suggests that being receptive of the other is not simply a matter of having care, concern, or interest, even though these emotions often facilitate receptivity. This can't be the whole story. Now, in line with this, theories in counseling psychology hold that therapeutic dialogues depend on various bodily factors, such as bodily behaviors, like gestures and postures, eye behaviors, like how you, the way you eye contact or glance away or not, or facial expressions, and voice behaviors, such as your tone, your pitch, or how you space your words and the like. And also spatial relation with the other. That is, for example, the angle at which you sit in relation to the other. So these theories say that these bodily factors strongly affect the quality of therapeutic dialogues. And this means that we can be dismissive of the other unintentionally by making missteps in our embodied attitudes. That is without lacking respect at a level in our minds, for example. So based on these reflections, we want to suggest that receptivity, we want to propose to understand receptivity in terms of an embodied and epistemic attitude. So on our account, being receptive is to be respectful of another's epistemic dignity, not simply intellectually or mentally, but also by attuning the embodied dynamics of interaction to the other or with the other. So to briefly summarize, we explore the role of mental stimulation for empathy. And based on a case of what we called empathy through listening, we argued, one, that empathic perspective taking, in this case, is an embodied collaborative practice, something that's not confined in an individual mind. And two, that mental simulation here serves two levels of empathy, that of imaginative perspective taking and realistic perspective sharing. And finally, we claim that mental simulation here leads to empathy by being grounded in the virtue of receptivity, which we elaborated on in terms of an embodied epistemic attitude of holding epistemic respect toward another agent, in part by making an embodied attunement with the other in question. So that's the end of the talk. This is my co-author Seisuke, and this is me. If you have questions or comments, please leave them in the comment section, and we look forward to discussing with you soon. Thank you.